Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This is a lecture of an introduction to the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. We'll go through basic concepts and a few of his major works in this lecture. Before we get started, for those of you getting started on reading Nietzsche, I thought I'd give a bit of advice on a few texts you can start with. There's a couple texts if you start with. You get the major works of Nietzsche in two volumes. So the first one is this Portable Nietzsche, edited and translated by Walter Kaufmann. So the Portable Nietzsche is a good place to start. It has the full text of the Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It has Twilight of the Idols, the Antichrist, selections from other works. So a good place to start. Thus Spoke Zarathustra alone is worth the price of admission, of course, and Walter Kaufmann's translations and general editorial introductions are always very good. He's also done the editing of the basic writings of Nietzsche. And in this text, you get The Birth of Tragedy, you get Beyond Good and Evil, Genealogy of Morals, Ecce Homo, and the full text of those works. So others of his major works. You might want to supplement that just for the sake of interest with his The Will to Power. So it's a collection of his notes taken over the course of the 1880s. And I know many of you who know a bit about Nietzsche will say, well, you have to be careful using the will to power. His sister took his notes and corrupted them and tried to make them support some of her own anti-Semitic views. Of course, since then, that was over 100 years ago, editors have been able to go back and try to stay closer to what Nietzsche meant and better the arrangement, include other notes, undo some of the editing that his sister had done. So let's get started. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint presentation that will help guide the discussion. So who was Friedrich Nietzsche? He's a philologist and classicist that lived and worked in the latter half of the 19th century. Somewhat of a prodigy, as I note here on the slide. He was the youngest person to hold the chair of classical philology at the University of Basel at the age of 24. So he's already showing such incredible genius at that young age. And in the course of his writings, he didn't have, let's say, people didn't have a full appreciation, I don't think, or many people didn't have a full appreciation of the impact of his work while he was alive. But since then, over the course of the 20th century, he's come to have immeasurable impact on aesthetic movements of the 20th century, psychoanalysis, Freud, Jung, as I note here, existentialism, and Heidegger, Sartre, Camus, structuralism in the social sciences, post-structuralism, and postmodernism generally. So Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, all of these figures who are so important in the course of 20th century philosophy and now still important in the 21st century. All of these are really, it's unimaginable that they would have a point of departure without Nietzsche. All of them take Nietzsche as their major first influence. He's been politically misappropriated. I mentioned how his sister tried to marshal some of his notes and emphasize certain aspects of his writings out of context to make them sound like they could support kind of a biological racist agenda, even though he was quite explicit about and severe in his criticism against people trying to define themselves by their race, and critical of German nationalism and anti-Semitism. But he was, let's say, misappropriated by National Socialism early in the 20th century in Germany. Also on the left, he's I would say misappropriated by various forms of postmodern cultural critics who try to see him as a champion of, let's say, uh, liberty, try against oppression, and try to see him as a early voice for labor movements and that type of thing. And he would was also very clear about the need for hierarchical order in society, and that there isn't a dignity and worth to the laborer in him or herself. So you have to be careful on that side. I think his philosophy, his works become, let's say, um, susceptible to that type of misappropriation because of his style of writing. Aphoristics, so short little expressions that are kind of pithy truisms, so to speak. Um, his works are artistic and poetic, so they can be interpreted in many ways. He has a prophetic, a religious tone. As I note here, his Thus Spoke Zarathustra in many ways echoes the New Testament, in particular the Gospel of Matthew. So he's open to many interpretations. However, I think his work is still incredibly relevant for us today in that he posed many questions for which we don't have adequate answers. We still don't have adequate answers. How do we determine right or wrong, true or false? Those types of things. If we've lost our transcendental foundations in the form moral epistemological judgments in a world post God, how do we do these things? One of the ways this manifests itself today is in discussions around the post-truth era. So today, all we have is information and misinformation and people trying to do things from their own perspective with information. It's a very Nietzschean world. It's a world that Nietzsche diagnosed and that we're living now because he diagnosed it. How do we live in that world? He felt that this is in some way behind truth values, but he didn't feel that a society, a community could live without some sort of securing truth. Also, how do we live in a post-human era? So post-humanism as a movement, seeing the ends and limits of humanity as normally defined. What does that mean? These are very Nietzschean questions as well. So let's start by looking at a few of his earlier writings and focusing in particular on the notion of the tragic that he explores in some of these early writings. So originally, earlier in the 19th century and the late 18th century, um, the scholars would see in the Greeks um, positive, superficial uh, notion of truth. They would see Greek sculpture, Greek philosophy as pointing to a very kind of transparent truth that is there, that is available, celebrating beauty, and that this, as I said, is in some ways superficial because it seems to avoid some of the, let's say, the negative aspects of human existence. Um, Nietzsche says that this artistic kind of focus on beauty and harmony arises out of the fact that they knew much horror and ugliness. So he has I think, a pithy little line in The Gay Science, a work he wrote in 1882, a little bit later. The Greeks were superficial out of profundity. So this is kind of already an aspect of the tragic, uh, that there's a needs to be this melding of kind of a superficial form, a beautiful form, but also an embracing of that which is horrible, ugly, that which can cause terror. In Homer's Contest, for instance, a very early essay of his, Nietzsche describes the essential role of conflict or strife, the goddess Eris, in Greek thought and culture. And he asserts that the serenity and rational calm of Greek art and culture arises as a result of channeling of this energy or this essential strife. So a quote from that essay: "But what do we behold when, no longer led and protected by the hand of Homer, we stride back into the pre-Homeric world? Only night and terror and an imagination accustomed to the horrible. What kind of earthly existence do these revolting, terrible theogonic myths reflect? A life ruled only by the children of the night: strife, lust, deceit, old age, and death." And in an essay written around the same time, The Greek State, he presents his understanding of how this natural strife that he describes in Homer's contest unfolds itself in human institutions and regimes. So the state becomes a way that nature takes this energy, this strife, and channels it, forms it into um, into manifestations that can support uh, higher achievements, individuals, great thoughts, great cultural achievements. So this is a quote from that essay. Here again, we see the degree to which nature, in order to bring society about, uses pitiless inflexibility to forge for herself the cruel tool of the state, namely that conqueror with the iron hand who is nothing but the objectification of the instinct indicated. So the cruel tool of the state is used by nature. So nature is purposive. It's trying to achieve its end as it evolves. There's kind of a Darwinian sense there. It evolves through strife, but its goal is the achievement of cultural flowers, blossoms in the form of great individuals who are great thinkers, great artists, these types of things. And the state is this kind of clamp iron, he says, that nature uses to achieve that end. So, in The Birth of Tragedy, his first book, his first full-length book that he published as a young classics scholar at the University of Basel, um, articulates this opposition between the Apollonian and Dionysian instincts in the Greeks. So, he gives in this kind of combination of beautiful form and kind of terror of existence, he gives them those names of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The book, I will say, was not received well by his scholarly peers, and this, I think, hurt Nietzsche quite a bit. At this point, he kind of withdrew from the scholarly community and pursued the life of an independent thinker. In fact, the subtitle for Human All Too Human is a book for free spirits. He kind of fashioned himself as a free spirit. He doesn't need to define himself according to the scholarly trends of the time. And I think kind of the reaction to The Birth of Tragedy was one of the triggers of that. So for Nietzsche, the Apollonian underlay the plastic arts and the Dionysian underlays music. In fact, the first subtitle of The Birth of Tragedy was Out of the Spirit of Music. He then reissued it in 1886, so 14 years later, with the subtitle Or Hellenism and Pessimism. And there's a reason for that, as we'll see in relation to Socrates. So Nietzsche sees in the Apollonian the spirit of measure, moderation, reason, and the Dionysian as intoxication, loss of oneself, excess, union with the one. And he felt that the Greeks needed an Apollonian veil of stability and being to be able to endure the Dionysian horror of existence as becoming. So there's a Dionysian terror to existence, and we need to kind of veil it with cultural static forms of a sculptural beauty that give form and give order to that terror. So Nietzsche saw tragedy as this conflict and this highest consummation as an art form, in that it brings together these two elements, the Dionysian and the Apollonian. And specifically in tragedy as an art form, they're brought together through a Dionysian chorus. So we don't have individuals in the chorus. We have the chorus is several individuals, maybe representing the old men of a city, and they speak with one voice. So the individual is lost in the many there. And the individualized characters represent the Apollonian elements. And here's a summary of some of these kind of oppositions you get with the Apollonian and Dionysian. You get, arts or techne versus nature, physis, sculpture versus music, restraint versus excess, individualization being Apollonian, unity or loss of the self being Dionysian, beauty versus horror, and being versus becoming. In that work, The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche sees the death of tragedy, the fact that it ended as a kind of the dominant art form towards the end of the fifth century, as arising out of the spirit of Socratic optimism. So the spirit that the world is rational, it's knowable, that virtue is knowledge, that if we know something, then if someone knows uh, how the world is, the order of the world, they will be good. And Euripides' tragedy, according to Nietzsche, follows the rationality of Socratism, reducing the role of the chorus and making the representation more naturalistic. So the tragic age of the Greeks was a way of finding meaning and justifying the horror of man's existence. So for Nietzsche, all other philosophic or religious justifications of existence are otherworldly or transcendental. They reject the present life in favor of an other world, a Hinterwelt in German. And so the sufferings and insufficiencies of this world are justified in another. We see this in Platonism, we see this in Kantianism, Buddhism, Christianity. So all these philosophical religious systems are otherworldly and see the truth of things and the meaning of things in that other world. For the Greeks, there's a tragic affirmation of life as it is in this life. There's an affirmation of the horror of existence in this unity of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. So we'll turn now to a few of his works from what we could call the middle period, where we see this Nietzsche undertakes kind of a systematic almost critique of knowledge, truth claims, morality claims. So beginning with knowledge, he critiques the notion that we can have knowledge for its own sake, or objective knowledge, disinterested knowledge. Um, and the point of departure of science, for instance, or the point of departure in lots of our everyday dealings is that we can try to know something in a disinterested way, in an objective way. And for Nietzsche, on the other hand, knowledge and truth are inventions of nature in its evolutionary unfolding. And they have as their goal the advancement of a species. They're done from a perspective, and we'll come back to that. So this is a quote from On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. An excellent essay, by the way. Yeah. Well, all these works, it's hard to single out any one, but these are the opening lines, which are, I think, are very seize the reader. Once upon a time, in some out of the way corner of that universe, which is dispersed into numberless twinkling solar systems, there was a star upon which clever beasts invented knowing. That was the most arrogant and mendacious minute of world history. But nevertheless, it was only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star cooled and congealed, and the clever beasts had to die. One might invent such a fable, and yet he still would not have adequately illustrated how miserable, how shadowy and transient, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect looks within nature. So, such a haunting vision of the cosmic scope of cosmic history, billions and billions of years of the unfolding of cosmic history, how we have this insignificant little rock, a speck of dust in the middle of this unfolding, and how for a minute, not even a minute, this creature comes along, invents knowing, and feels that it's somehow captured all of this, that has captured the truth of these things, that this truth and that this knowledge are substantial. Yet it, like all things in the cosmos, is fleeting, it's shadowy, it's doesn't have a substance. Um, so he says later in this essay, what is truth? He says, truth is a mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms. So we take something as true, um, we we kind of form truths by metaphoric operations. Like we think the love is a red, red rose is a famous metaphor, right? It's a metaphor that you would hear in love poetry. And the metaphor stands out as metaphor because we know that love is not a red, red rose. But in our operations of trying to form truth, we undertake a similar exercise of trying to make something that's unknown knowable by placing on it something that we can experience, something we have experienced, something that is knowable, or at least let's say familiar to us. And this metaphorical extension of what we've already adapted to our own behavior, and this what is new and what is to be shaped, that metaphorical extension is forgotten. The example I use is contragate. So back in the late 80s, there was a scandal in the in the Reagan administration called Contragate. Now, it was had to do with these group of Contras that was supported by the U.S. government, the shadow government, so to speak, without proper approvals through Congress, what have you. So that it became a scandal, and they called it Contragate. So by doing so, they undertook a metaphor that has now been forgotten as a metaphor. So Watergate was kind of, let's say, the presidential scandal under Nixon, and Watergate was the name of a hotel. And through the metaphorical operation of comparing the two scandals by adding the word, almost a suffix now, gate, onto the contra part, they are able to make any, let's say, activity associated with scandals to this kind of metaphoric attachment. One can imagine that the suffix gate will start to kind of lose its meaning. Maybe it becomes like it'll have a meaning when used as a suffix, as it already does, I guess, of meaning scandal of some sort. And people would say, well, how is that, how's that related to a gate, a gate in a fence or something like that? It's not originally in terms of the historical unfolding. It's a metaphor where we've forgotten that it was a metaphor now. And it's so this again is Nietzsche's example of how we make truths and we forget about their roots in terms of comparison, anthropomorphisms, and metonymies that we've forgotten. So, according to certain interpretations of Nietzsche, there is truth. There is a truth there. We maybe we can't get a full grasp of it, but because we'll always have, let's say, a glimpse of it from a perspective, or we know it in a certain way that bends it to the purposes of life. Okay, so we always maybe there's a truth out there, according to this interpretation. As I said, the other interpretation is that there is no truth for Nietzsche. So it's kind of a question in Nietzsche scholarship. What is Nietzsche's view on truth? And the point of departure, as we'll see with perspectivism and will to power, with these as his kind of fundamental metaphysical points of departure, it leads to certain, let's say, paradoxes with respect to trying to define truth for Nietzsche. So let's take as a point of departure, let's assume that Nietzsche believes there is truth to existence. Maybe it's not fully graspable, but this truth needs to be appropriated, needs to be approached if we want to value life, so to speak, for the advancement of whether it's the species or for the highest types, the highest individuals within a species. We will need to take a perspective on truth as a society, as an individual, that allows for the cultivation of those highest types. Sometimes a way of knowing of truth can lead to the opposite, and we'll talk about that. So, for instance, one example I like to think of is, and this is my example, not Nietzsche's. The second bullet is, maybe it's technically true. Maybe scientists will tell you, that it's a chemical reaction in nature. That's this attraction of two mates, and that humans, when they get together and get married and have children. It's a just a different expression of that type of natural chemical interaction. Um, so, as I say here, maybe it's nothing but a biochemical process of signal and response between two animals, so to speak. But such knowledge could be destructive for individuals and for the species. So, knowledge is always from a perspective, and knowledge or perspective can be either life enhancing or life denying. Okay, so there's a critique of science here to some extent, since science, to some extent for Nietzsche, will take an approach to truth that, well, first of all, tries to be objective. It denies that it has a perspective, which is false. And secondly, can lead to an approach to the things themselves that can lead to nihilism. It can lead to uh, life uh, life denying results, as opposed to uh, an approach that can lead to self-affirmation, the affirmation and advancement of a species. And here's an example to kind of to further that point that Nietzsche gives in another great essay it's a short essay, maybe 60 pages, The Uses and Disadvantages of History for Life. So good, excellent reflections on this concept of history, but also the concept of truth and how we approach it. So the quote goes, if by contrast, the doctrines of sovereign becoming, of the fluidity of all concepts, types, and styles, the lack of all cardinal differences between man and animal, doctrines which I consider true but deadly, are still foisted on the people for another generation with the frenzy of instruction which is now customary, then perhaps systems of individual egotism, alliances for the systematic larcenous exploitation of those non-members of the alliance, and similar creations of utilitarian nastiness will step forward onto the future scene. So this was written 1874. So had 150 years basically of since then of teaching exactly those doctrines of the lack of the cardinal differences between man and animal, of the fluidity of ideas and concepts. So we've had 150 years of the history that he, I think, prophetically points out here, where we have generations that follow this, that they don't seem to believe in foundation of truth, so can embrace systems of individual or group egotism, alliances for exploitation of other non-members of other groups, that type of thing. And to the violence of the 20th century could be one example. Um, he also, in these, let's say, middle works, critiques, in as much as we knowledge is from a perspective, and knowledge claims can be critiqued and truth claims can be critiqued, so can claims of moral truth. So in particular, Christian morality receives quite vigorous critique in Nietzsche's works beginning in this period, and that holds true throughout his career afterwards. um, and this is a quote from Human All Too Human. Even today, many educated people think that the victory of Christianity over Greek philosophy is a proof of the superior truth of the former, although in this case it was only the coarser and more violent that conquered the more spiritual and delicate. So far as superior truth is concerned, it is enough to observe that the awakening sciences have allied themselves point by point with the philosophy of Epicurus, but point by point rejected Christianity. And again, this is from Daybreak, another one of these early works. Our century denies this perilousness, so fear of eternal punishment for sins. So we no longer believe in that, but these were Christian beliefs, and does so with a good conscience. Yet it continues to drag along with it the old habits of Christian security, Christian enjoyment, recreation, evaluation. So we don't believe in God anymore. And we're going to come back to this when we talk about the death of God in the gay science. Okay. We don't believe in God anymore, as generally speaking. Obviously, individuals, there are many individuals who still do, but as a kind of a unifying cultural force where, as opposed to, let's say, the Middle Ages in Europe, where basically everyone had the same core beliefs and followed a certain Christian value system. This is not the case today. Today, let's say the overriding uh, universally accepted truth claims would be the claims of science. So we don't believe in that anymore, but we carry along with us old Christian comfort systems of, well, it's still nice to be good to people and it's still nice not to steal. There's an abyss there, Nietzsche wants to point out. And this is what the death of God, and we'll see that in the gay science, points to so significantly. It even drags them into its noblest arts and philosophies. How worn out and feeble, how insipid and awkward, how arbitrarily fanatical, and above all, how insecure all this must appear now that the fearful antithesis to it, the omnipresent fear of the Christian for his eternal salvation, has been lost. So we bring along the Christian virtues and etc., but we don't believe God is the anchor anymore. And with that has also the fear of eternal damnation and what have you has also been lost. So let's get to this discussion of God is dead in the gay science, and thus spoke Zarathustra. So he famously summarized his insights into modern nihilism with the line, God is dead, in section 125 of the gay science. So we discover there that humanity killed God. And we discover later in other works that what he means by this is out of the scientific will to truth. So the scientific exploration of all beings led to a point where kind of God as an anchoring epistemic and moral principle is no longer tenable. Remember too here, the death of God is the death of the Christian God. So people don't accept that as a foundation anymore. But also, let's say the Platonic ideals, um, the notion of a truth in itself. So with God is dead, think of truth is dead, Platonic ideals are dead, these types of things. So all these anchors of how we know things are anchors of our morality. So humanity killed God, and also we find out that the death of God leaves humanity and the earth, beings as a whole, let's say, without a direction or a center of gravity. And we find out that humanity is not ready to hear the words of the one who would expose them to this lack of center. So this is a quote. We'll read this in its entirety, this section 125. It's just, I think it really hits home so much of what is at stake here. So the heading is The Madman. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I seek God, I seek God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. Has he got lost? Asked one. Did he lose his way like a child? Asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage? Emigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. Whither is God? He cried. I will tell you, we have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? And backward, sideward, forward, and in all directions? Is there still any up or down? So again, as I said, that point of there's no direction. There's no right, wrong, true, false. There's without a foundation, without a center point. Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we not hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. I'll just make a point on this. God is dead. God remains dead is an allusion to the Hegelian dialectic. So for the Hegelian dialectic, he points to Christianity as a privileged way in which the spirit unfolds historically in time. So the spirit or the idea unfolds for Hegel as this action of positing one thing, usually translated as thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? So it unfolding in time. So in that unfolding, we can have the positing of of God, of God dying as the Christian God does, and then being resurrected in a synthesis that brings humanity back in line with the divine. Okay, so this synthesis of the human and the divine. So it's a reference to the Christian mythology of the dying God who resurrects. But it's also a reference to Hegel's adoption of that as part of the unfolding of the spirit in time that will be resurrected in a new sublation. Here, no, though God remains dead and we have killed him. God is dead, God remains dead. It's not going to be sublated into a higher synthesis. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed. And whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than history hitherto. That's a question. I think that Zarathustra kind of, thus spoke Zarathustra picks up on, as we'll see, this trope of the madman, picks up on the notion of God is dead. But the question is, what is his history afterwards? Are we going to have a higher history of the Overman, let's say, that we'll talk about in a second, that is, let's say, capable of this deed of overcoming humanity as it is, or the last man, and that's the danger. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners. They too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern to the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. It has been related further that on the same day, the madman forced his way into several churches and there struck up his Requiem Aeternam Deo. Led out and called to account, he is said always to have replied nothing but, what after all are these churches now if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God? So the people don't react, right? The people, he realizes the people can't hear these words yet. They're not ready for it. And we'll see this is very much the what happens to Thus Spoke Zarathustra in Thus Spoke Zarathustra to Zarathustra as he goes to the people in the marketplace. Um, it's it's also reminiscent, first of all, I'll just say, to the philosopher who returns to the cave in Plato's Republic. So he's also going to be ridiculed. He's how, what are you talking about? You're not very good at predicting the shadows that come on the wall. So do read that in book 7 of the Republic. But also you see this in the prologue to Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So the Zarathustra seems in a lot of ways, to get to Nietzsche's next book written right after the Gay Science, he seems like another incarnation of this madman. So he asserts that God is dead. Notably, in the prologue, he says this to himself. He does not say God is dead to the market, the general populace. I think it could be like this is the madman after realizing Zarathustra is like the madman after realizing that that is not the way to teach the people. He asserts that God is dead, as I said. He also teaches the eternal return of the same, a concept that's first introduced by Nietzsche in The Gay Science in section 341. Note, section 341 is the first statement of this eternal recurrence of the same. Then the next section, section 342, are the exact same lines of Thus Spoke, the opening of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, except he has as a header incipit tragedia. So the tragedy begins. So the eternal return, Zarathustra as teaching the eternal return, is tied in some way to the tragic. And it's about this notion, I think, and the affirming existence as it is without an external justification, an otherworldly justification. So before we get started on Zarathustra any further, I'll just highlight the fact that it's his dramatic work. It has to be read as a drama. It's a narrative text. So his other works are aphoristic or genealogy of morals is really a philosophical essay. His uses and disadvantages of history is also close to an essay with kind of a logical, articulated argument. Um, but for the most part, the other works are aphoristic. Well, sorry, Birth of Tragedy also has that flavor of a essayistic work. The other works are aphoristic. Both both the essays, the argumentative essays, and the aphoristic works, they don't have a drama with characters that unfold. Like this is very much a literary text, and we have to look at the literary character of it. So the Zarathustra is a character who develops and unfolds. And so there are things that happen in the first part to him, and he learns from them, and his teaching evolves. His teachings in part one are on the Overman or the Ubermensch. And I think we're meant to see, and he doesn't talk about them in the later books. I think he has to surpass that teaching, and he has to move on to other teachings. And I will say Lawrence Lampert, he has a book called Nietzsche's Teaching, which is a close reading of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He's dynamite on this point, and I agree with him 100% that you have to read this as a drama and see how there are limits to the teachings in the first books that are somehow, let's say, supplemented or surpassed in the later works. So the first part, he goes down. So there's a prologue, and he goes down to this town, Motley Cow. He goes to the marketplace, and he's going to an all, so to speak. Um, Over the course of the prologue, he realizes he can't speak to the many. They're not going to listen, just like the madman, right? So madman realized the marketplace that they're not going to listen to him. So he realizes he has to select a few disciples that will be able to get some of what he's talking about. So the course of part one is him selecting disciples and gathering some disciples. So in a way, you know, I neglected to mention the subtitle of Zarathustra. It's a book for all and for none. And in the course of the work, he goes from teaching all to none. He goes from teaching the marketplace, everyone, in part one. Part two, he's teaching a few. He's teaching the disciples that he's uh, collected. And then by the end of part three, he's alone. He's talking to himself, basically. Um, and the major teaching in part one is the Overman, at least in the prologue. It even wanes off during the course of part one. Uh, the central teaching of part two is the will to power. And then the central teaching of part three is the eternal return. And at the end, he returns to his cave. And in a way, we get the beginning of the prologue again. We almost have a cycle. There is a fourth part, which is kind of an interlude. It doesn't follow this three-part structure. It wasn't published in his time. It was shared privately with some friends. And I agree again with Lampert of not including it as part of this kind of story, so to speak. This goes over a little bit more detail what I just described as kind of the the summary narrative of what uh, uh, Zarathustra does in the course of his teachings. So if we go to this concept of the last man and the overman, so he goes to the all, to the marketplace in the prologue of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And we could see this as humanity in its fallen aspects. The crowd, the marketplace is the crowd, the we as a function of public opinion and social conditions. Um, this fallen aspect of humanity is an essential aspect of our condition, but we have to be able to move beyond it to become individuals. So to this all, he teaches the overman. He tries to tell them that, we need to think about, or we need to point, usher in a new kind of over humanity that's able to overcome the limits of current humanity. Um, and he sees they're not reacting. So he says, okay, I have to appeal to their pride. So I'll speak of this last man, which is, let's say, the danger within, let's say, modern liberal democracies, modern nihilism, I would say, is another way of thinking about it, where we're not able to create aspects of humanity that overreach and that become reach towards an overman, so to speak, because we're satisfied with uh, consumer products, we're satisfied with our own kind of liberal freedoms, and not challenged to create beyond ourselves, not enabled to. I think the other, as I said, nihilism, if we're paralyzed because we see that everything is equally valueless and that the only value is really kind of comfort and consumer comforts, those types of things, then there's not going to be the creative spark to reach towards something that is uh, something like the Overman. As I said, this teaching is to the marketplace, is early in Zarathustra's development. In the prologue, he's ridiculed by those in the marketplace, and he realizes he must teach to the few, he must find disciples. So books 1 and 2 consist of him selecting and then teaching these disciples. This is the prologue. Again, this is on the Overman. Man is a rope tied between beast and Overman, a rope over an abyss. What is what is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end. What can be loved in man is that he is an overture and a going under, a untergehen. I say unto you, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. I say unto you, you still have chaos in yourselves. So this is the question: can we give birth to a dancing star? Is there still chaos in us to give birth to something like that? The danger is that there wouldn't be this the possibility of creative difference, possibility of conflict, of tension that would be able to create beyond ourselves, because we live in a state of the last man, of equilibrium. Nothing is better than anything else. Thus, there can be no kind of gradation or value. There can be no conflict. There can only be this kind of equilibrium of consumer choices. Alas, the time has come when man will no longer give birth to a star. Alas, the time of the most despicable man is coming, he that is no longer able to despise himself. So that's the danger. Behold, I show you the last man. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? Thus asks the last man, and he blinks. I love those. He says this, he repeats it several times. And we get this sense of they've become cows, there's a herd of cows, and they just stand there chewing their cud. And this last man is a herd, and they can only respond by blinking because they probably haven't fully comprehended the words. The earth has become smaller, and on it hops the last man, who makes everything small. His race is as ineradicable as the flea beetle. The last man lives longest. We have invented happiness, say the last man, and they blink. So the teaching of the marketplace of the overman occurs early, as we said. Book 2 will teach the concept of the will to power to the few, his disciples, and then book 3, the return to none. So the will to power, and he explicates it more fully in later works, and most fully still probably in his collected notes of the 1880s. called the will to power. Um, it's uh, it's not to be confused with, let's say, an individual desire to have power. Let us say that can be one way in which it manifests itself, but for Nietzsche, it's the fundamental way or the nature of all existence, how it unfolds. So it's a complex configuration of drives and forces. All of these constitute the kind of willing of willing to grasp and have power over another. One drive is trying to dominate another drive, and that's will to power. Maybe an amoeba overcoming uh, or wrapping its little pseudopods around something and overcoming it is manifesting a will to power. Um, and all of these drives are trying to impress their perspective on their surroundings. So this is what he sees as a fundamental, let's say, fundamental aspect of all of existence. And religious and philosophical systems, Platonism, for example, are particular manifestations of the will to power, are the particular ways of trying to lay out the lines and trying to set the standards for things. Now, for Nietzsche, there are some manifestations of the will to power which are affirmative, life affirming, life enhancing, and some which end up being dead ends. Again, it's an evolutionary model. It's almost Darwinian in the sense that there can be different permutations of uh, individual genetic mutations from a species' basic genome, and some will enable the advancement of that species in a particular ecosystem. Some will be dead ends. For Nietzsche, Platonism and Christianity might have been useful in a certain context, but have become stultifying and dead ends for humanity. We have to overcome them. So too with political social structures, he sees nationalism, for instance, as the product of a life-denying will and that falsifies their identity to try to find meaning. Artistic forms, of course, the Greek tragedy, as we saw, like he really saw that as an expression of the highest affirmative, life affirming, life enhancing will that embraces this existence and finds meaning in it. So later in those other works, as I said, where we'll see more development of this concept of will to power, he really delineates this life enhancing versus life denying, affirmative versus negative wills. You'll see, say, for instance, in the Antichrist, he interprets early Judaism as a product of this type of life-enhancing, affirmative will to power. Later, Christianity would pervert that root. It had its roots, Christianity had its roots in Judaism, which was very life-enhancing, but perverted those roots. So in book three, as I said, we turn to the eternal return of the same, and for Nietzsche, eternal return is the highest form of affirmation. Okay, so it's the highest form of life enhancing will to power. So willing the eternal return is the highest way in which to manifest a will that is the advancement of life. It's the highest expression of the will to power. So I like to think of it always as, let's say, uh, a way of thinking beyond the common traps we get into. So we often find ourselves, thinking of this as being a moment or a transitionary period. This moment I'm in is a transitionary period until, this, if you're an undergraduate, until this undergrad is over and then I can get my degree and then everything will be okay because I've got my degree and I'll get a job. Or after this course is over, then that'll be good. I get this credit, I write the final exam, that'll be good. I think for Nietzsche's basically saying, like everything is all right now. There's only now and what you make of it. So there's rather than looking for the meaning or the justification in the action now and saying, okay, well, the meaning of that action will be when I'm done. Okay. It's outside of this action or this moment. So that would be um, a an external or otherworldly, to get back to that expression, an otherworldly justification of these actions, trying to see the justification in them in something that's beyond the action. So the actual action itself is the meaning, has to be the meaning. The moment has to have value in itself because all these things are connected. Because of the eternal return of the same, you're going to have to live that moment a million times, infinite number of times. If you think of it in its kind of literal form, um, then that means that it's not a temporary thing that you're just doing to get it over with, and then you can enjoy the rest of a peaceful eternity. No, this is something that has to be chosen for itself in itself. So the eternal return of the same is for Nietzsche, and affirming it is the way out of nihilism. It's the way out of the crisis of nihilism, but it's a way out of the crisis of nihilism by completing it, so to speak. And we'll talk about that in a second. I'll just point out it on. I have another lecture that goes into a bit more detail on what is nihilism and goes through Nietzsche's views on nihilism. So I'll be brief on that here. But for Nietzsche, and I'll put a link to that lecture on what is nihilism in the description. I'll also put some links to other works I have on Nietzsche, other introductory materials, as well as other academic essays I have on Nietzsche. So the way out of nihilism is by going through nihilism. According to Nietzsche, we can't just go back to a time of where we believed in truths that are no longer tenable anymore. We have to go through, and the way through is by affirming its consequences. And the highest form of affirmation, as we said, is affirming the eternal return. We have to affirm the eternal return of nihilism, the eternal return of nothing. So as I said, I'll skip this a little bit. I go into this in a bit more detail in my essay on the other video on what is nihilism, but this goes in. This is basically a bit more detail on that point I just made about how the eternal return is this completion of nihilism, because um, in nihilism, all is permitted, and we affirm that everything is permitted. Beings are allowed to arise as they would outside of an external framework. Okay, now so we've talked about his early works, the tragic, the critique of knowledge, truth, morality. God is dead in the gay science, and then this notion of the Overman and the last man and the will to power and the eternal return in Zarathustra. And now some of his last works, I want to highlight quickly: Beyond Good and Evil, on the genealogy of morals, where he goes into that history of nihilism I just went over very quickly, um, uh, to highlight how, in a bit more detail, this notion of the will to power, what it means, is basic metaphysical position. If we take nothing from Nietzsche, we need to take this notion of the will to power, how it is his basic kind of metaphysical position. So Nietzsche finds, we're in a crisis of nihilism. Things don't have value. God is dead. We don't have that foundation. So we need to uh, be able to posit true and false, good and bad. And we have to do these things because, remember, back to that, something I think he held since his early writings, there may be these truths that we've discovered that, things can be true or false or whatever, or that there's no center to space, or movement is only relative, and we are directionless, but we need to posit a direction. We need to posit values, because these things may be true, but they're deadly. You can't have a community this way. You can't cultivate great individuals this way. Um, so his principle of a new valuation, the basis upon which he thinks a new valuation can be posited, is the will to power. So he uses the will to power as the measuring stick, so to speak, the foundation to say, okay, is a value system life enhancing according to the standards of will to power? Does it allow for the highest manifestations of the will to power as life enhancing versus life denying? Um, so to dig more into this notion of, okay, well, what is will to power? It's good to think of it in connection with perspectivism as well. So there's this, as I said, will to power drives overcoming other drives in order to assert to draw the lines on reality and say how things are going to go. And some are life enhancing, some are life denying. Another way of looking at these various drives and forces is as perspectives, as interpretations of the world. So this is from section 481 of the Will to Power, another uh, important work, as I said, a collection of notes against positivism, which halts at phenomena. There are only facts. I would say no, facts is precisely what there is not, only interpretations. We cannot establish any fact in itself. Perhaps it is folly to want to do such a thing. Everything is subjective, you say, but even this is interpretation. So this is an important distinction to keep in mind. Nietzsche's perspectivism is not the same as saying, oh, he's just saying everything's subjective. Because even the subject, myself, I'm a product of a million different forces and perspectives. There's Tim the father, Tim the government worker, Tim the prof who teaches Nietzsche. There's other forces and drives, economic, social, political, personal, these types of things, familial, directionalities that will determine in any moment, from moment to moment, and even within those moments, that there are an infinite number of selves beneath that so-called subject, that self. So the subject too is also just a fiction, is also just kind of a superficial surface phenomena that is hiding a chaos of drives and forces, the will to power. The will to power sets up the subject in order to provide a little clarity and fixity for me from moment to moment, to allow me to get me through the day. So the subject is not something given, it is something added and invented, projected behind what there is. Finally, is it necessary to posit an interpreter behind the interpretation? Even this is invention, hypothesis. Insofar as the word knowledge has any meaning, the world is knowable, but it is interpretable otherwise. It has no meaning behind it, but countless meanings. Perspectivism. It is our needs that interpret the world, our drives, and their for and against. Every drive is a kind of lust to rule. Each one has its perspective that it would like to compel all the other drives to accept as a norm. So a powerful section I often refer to when trying to think about Nietzsche's will to power, perspectivism, and how it's working. So in his work Beyond Good and Evil, and particularly in on the genealogy of morality, we see these life-enhancing and life-denying forms of the will to power in the conflict between noble and slave morality, we could say. And he has different names for these, and it's a complicated history, but we'll take it at as simplest as we can. So he claims there's two fundamental outlooks or types of evaluating the noble and the slave. And obviously the noble is life affirming, affirms his or her strength and power and urgency, and um, sees that as good, and then sees the slave who is, let's say, weak, and sees uh, any expressions of weakness, sees that as bad. So we have good versus bad. And the slave morality, uh, they point of departure, being weaker and resenting the nobles, the strong nobles who are keeping them down, so to speak. They begin from a moment of out of resentment, out of envy, let us say, by a negation. So instead of that primary affirmation, life affirmation, saying, oh, I feel good, strength is good. That's what the noble kind of a morality of strength does. The slave is in a position of weakness and begins by seeing that which causes it pain, etc., or presents limits and sees that as evil. I negate that. That is horrible. That is evil. What keeps me down is evil. And what is the opposite of that is good. So I'm the opposite of that. So my weakness is good or passivity is good, that type of thing. So this is a reactive value system as opposed to an active value system or a negating one. It begins with a negation rather than an affirmation. So Nietzsche sees this at work in kind of, uh, generally speaking, in the earliest manifestations of uh, before Platonism, before Christianity. It led to thousands of years ago, the first creation of priestly caste, the slave inversion of morality, that said, oh no, your noble strength is actually evil, and us, we're weak, and we restrain our lusts, our desires, and that is what is called good. So he sees that as a kind of the original priestly inversion of values. Sees that in Zoroastrianism, Christianity later on, that type of thing. Okay, so there you have it in terms of kind of the early writings, the tragic, middle writings, the critique of knowledge and truth, God is dead and the crisis that poses in the gay science. Thus spoke Zarathustra, uh, kind of an infinitely complex book that tries to build on that insight of God is dead. And so where do we go next? We go Overman, Will to Power, the eternal return of the same. And then his last books that really looked at the will to power in a bit more detail, and how they manifested themselves throughout the history of humanity in kind of slave morality form, noble morality form. So just some concluding questions maybe to close, we might ask ourselves, Nietzsche feels, we need to overcome the Western tradition, Platonism, Christianity, because it has been the history of nihilism. Uh, and we could ask ourselves, is this the only, let's say, fruit that the tradition has wrought, or is the tradition our only lifeblood and hope for a rational appreciation and the dignity of each life? So for Nietzsche, and then many of those philosophers I mentioned quickly at the beginning who follow him. So Heidegger, but in particular the post-structuralists, Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault, and everyone after them. The deconstruction of the West is a moving beyond the West, and all of what the West uh, represents in order to create an entirely new value system. So is that true? Okay, that's number one question. Another question, I guess, assuming Nietzsche is correct that we need to overcome the history of nihilism, does he succeed in providing a path to that overcoming in his teachings of the Overman, Will to Power, Eternal Return? I have another video on overcoming nihilism that goes into this question in a bit more detail. In generally speaking, reference to Nietzsche, but not solely on Nietzsche. So I would say that, in my personal opinion, uh, Nietzsche's teaching diagnoses nihilism. I don't think it gives us a path beyond nihilism. That's my own personal opinion. And then we might ask ourselves, what are the implications of our Nietzsche's writings for our understanding of the good life? So the Overman, does that help us in any way try to understand what the good life might be, this notion of the Overman? Or is the Overman a kind of extension of modern technological drive to master and control all nature? And this is really the interpretation of Martin Heidegger. Will to power, perspectivism, does this help us, or does this lead to the fragmented self of modernism? I think it does. I think it leads to the fragmented self that we see in T.S. Eliot, that we see in the stream of consciousness of a Joyce, etc. The eternal return, does that help us in terms of understanding the good, our existence, or is this the only way to genuinely affirm all that there is, that lets beings be rather than try to master them? And this is Lawrence Lampert's ultimate conclusion in discussing Zarathustra. I don't think so. So, as I said, I'll refer to that other video on overcoming nihilism. I don't think that this provides the path. I think we have to grapple with Nietzsche. That's why he's been someone I've returned to for over 3 decades now. I think we have to grapple with Nietzsche and try to understand the diagnosis, try to understand the implications of the teaching. Um, I I think the eternal return of affirming the moment is, if in as much as it can be seen as that, as affirming the moment and the meaning of the moment in itself, outside of external justification, can be a route for many and has been, if it's properly understood. So I don't want to dismiss it, and that's for that reason I say it's worthy of deep consideration. So uh, I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to Nietzsche's works and basic concepts. I'll probably have other videos that go into more detail on some of the works, like Zarathustra. I want to go through that section by section, in great detail, as well as the other concepts. So perspectivism, the tragic, have separate videos on those. Let me know in the comments what would be useful for you, as you try to read Nietzsche. Any works you'd like to go into more depth. I'd love to discuss them in more depth. Nietzsche, one of my favorite authors. Thank you very much.